So this is the second chunk to lecture 14 as we wrap up the citric acid cycle here. We're going to move away from the citric acid cycle itself, which we finished in the first chunk, and talk instead about how we control this beast and how we regulate the citric acid cycle. The last chunk of this series will talk about the larger attributes of the citric acid cycle, and what I mean by that is how does the citric acid cycle contribute not only to breaking molecules down, but to making biomolecules as well as playing a large role in animals. But let's talk first about controlling and regulating the citric acid cycle. As an entire process, if we consider all 8 steps of this cycle, we see that the citric acid cycle is exergonic. It's got a delta G of about negative 44 kilojoules per mole. It's a lot. It's almost 1.5 ATPs worth of energy. And we can break those energetics down step by step of the citric acid cycle and see that overall, from step to step, and if we include the PDC in that calculation here, we include the PDC, we see that we get all the way to about almost 80 kilojoules per mole that we release, 44 if we discount the PDC. Only one reaction in the citric acid cycle is energy hogging, is highly endergonic, and that's the last step, step 8, that last redox reaction that we talked about. But that's okay because step 8 is coupled. It's coupled to one of the most exergonic reactions of the citric acid cycle. But wait a minute, step 8 is the last step of the citric acid cycle. So what is it coupled to? Aren't you done with the citric acid cycle when you've completed step 8? Remember, this is the citric acid cycle. It never stops. So what step comes after step 8? Step 1 does. We always repeat this from its end to its next beginning. And if you look at the energetics of step 1, you see that step 1 has a delta G of about negative 32 kilojoules per mole. So step 8 is coupled to step 1. It's almost as if step 1 drags step 8 along before it so that the citric acid cycle can continue one more time, which is a really interesting and novel way to think about this cycle. When it comes to regulating the citric acid cycle, turning it up, turning it down, turning it on, turning it off, there are 3 major control points within the citric acid cycle itself, 3 enzymes which are regulated, and a 4th control point if we consider the PDC. So let's start with some major themes. Why are we doing this? Why are we metabolizing glucose? Why did we make pyruvate? Why did we do the citric acid cycle? What is it we're trying to make? Presumably, we're doing all of this to make ATP. The cell is likely running low on available energy, and so we're doing all of this as an effort to make more ATP. If that's true, when would it make common sense not to do any of this? Well, it seems to me that if ATP levels are high and the cell has plenty of available ATP already on hand, why would it do any of this? And it wouldn't. So if you keep those big themes in mind, those common sense perspectives, you'll keep straight what can and cannot regulate the citric acid cycle. ATP, in general, inhibits the cycle, and for what should now be obvious reasons. If you have ATP around, why would you do the citric acid cycle in the first place? So the presence of high levels of ATP inhibits this cycle. NADH also inhibits the citric acid cycle. That's a little bit more of a head scratcher. Why would NADH inhibit the citric acid cycle? Well, what have I been referring to the citric acid cycle as for a while now? It's an electron harvester. More than anything else, the citric acid cycle allows the cell to harvest electrons from what was once glucose. NADH is the reduced form of NAD. If you've got high levels of NADH around, that means you have a lot of harvested electrons. Why would you run a cycle that really serves no purpose other than to harvest electrons when you already have electrons harvested? It's a good point. Energetically speaking, from the broad view, the cell is looking at ATP. But more specifically, zeroed in on the citric acid cycle itself, the cell looks to NADH levels. Don't run an electron harvester if you already have electrons on hand. We can also apply this logic in reverse. The PDC is activated by high levels of ADP. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does, because if ADP levels are high, that means you've burned through much of your ATP. You're running low on ATP if you have a lot of ADP. So this activates the PDC, creates acetyl-CoA so that you can go ahead and make more ATP as a result. In mammals, like us, this type of regulation that I'm describing, specifically for the PDC, is achieved through phosphorylation events. When ATP levels are high and ADP levels are low, that is when energy is abundant, the PDC is phosphorylated by a kinase, and that phosphorylation slows the PDC down. It causes less pyruvate to be converted into acetyl-CoA. As that balance shifts and ADP levels go up, which means ATP levels have dropped, the need for more ATP is back in the cell. That means we need to make acetyl-CoA, and so the PDC is activated through a dephosphorylation reaction. A phosphatase enzyme dephosphorylates the PDC, removing that inhibiting phosphate group that was just added, and allows that PDC to be working at full throttle once again. It seems like we talked about the PDC quite a while ago, but remember, we talked about 5 enzymes being in the PDC, 5 different types of enzymes, and we only talked about 3 of them in the actual conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. I briefly made mention that enzyme number 4 was a kinase and enzyme number 5 was a phosphatase, both of those present for the regulation of this enzyme, and here's where they rear their head. The kinase and phosphatase are working right here to regulate and moderate PDC levels in direct response to ATP levels and ADP levels. In the end, it boils down to if energy levels are high, the PDC is off, you don't make acetyl-CoA, and if you don't make acetyl-CoA, you don't run the citric acid cycle. Likewise, if energy levels are low, the PDC is on, acetyl-CoA is made, the citric acid cycle runs, electrons are harvested, and eventually used to make ATP. In addition to ADP and ATP levels, acetyl-CoA itself also inhibits the PDC. Now this sounds like feedback inhibition. It sounds like when the product of an enzyme inhibits its own activity, but that's not necessarily the case here. We can't just kind of assume that the acetyl-CoA that inhibits the PDC came from the PDC itself. We don't have time to talk about it in this course, but acetyl-CoA can come from many different sources. We actually saw this very briefly earlier. I showed this diagram once before and didn't make much mention of it, but if we look a little closely, we see that this is the road we've been on for a while now. We started with glucose. Glycolysis converted that glucose into pyruvate. The PDC converted that pyruvate into acetyl-CoA, releasing carbon dioxide as a result, and that acetyl-CoA was fed into the citric acid cycle. But look here, fatty acids can also be converted into acetyl-CoA through a process called beta oxidation, which unfortunately we don't have time to cover here. Very, very interesting process. And even amino acids themselves can be metabolized to acetyl-CoA. So acetyl-CoA can come from many different sources, and if acetyl-CoA levels are high, regardless of where that acetyl-CoA came from, the PDC doesn't need to be active. Why make acetyl-CoA from pyruvate when you can get this acetyl-CoA from other sources? So this isn't technically feedback inhibition, because the acetyl-CoA that's inhibiting the PDC doesn't necessarily have to come from the PDC itself. If you're getting plenty of acetyl-CoA from any source, then you really don't need to use pyruvate for that process. You can save that pyruvate for later or use it for other purposes. So that's how the PDC is regulated. That's that 4th control point I kind of made mention of. But let's talk about the control points, the 3 control points that are within the citric acid cycle itself. In brief, these are the regulations of step 1, step 3, and step 4. Essentially the first step of the citric acid cycle and the 2 oxidative decarboxylation events. Citrate synthase, the enzyme that's responsible for step 1 of the citric acid cycle, is inhibited by ATP, NADH, succinyl-CoA, and its own product citrate. Wow, that's a lot of things that can turn this enzyme down. Those first 2 inhibitors, ATP and NADH, keep this step in the citric acid cycle in general sensitive to energetics in the cell. If ATP levels are high, you don't need the citric acid cycle because you don't need to make more ATP. If NADH levels are high, you don't need to run the citric acid cycle because you got plenty of electrons around. Both of those are from a perspective of energetics. The second 2 inhibitors are more providing information about the rate of the citric acid cycle itself. We touched on this a little bit with glycolysis as well. If citrate levels are high, that means step 1 is progressing too rapidly relative to the other steps. You're getting a buildup of citrate because the other later steps of the citric acid cycle can't keep up. That's a good reason to slow step 1 down. You don't want to have step 1 continue and get higher and higher levels of citrate. Having succinyl-CoA as a regulator of this enzyme allows the enzyme to keep tabs on what's going on later on in the citric acid cycle. Perhaps the second half of the citric acid cycle is backing up. If these later steps of the citric acid cycle here were slowing down, succinyl-CoA levels would build. In other words, there'd be a traffic jam here, no place for succinyl-CoA to go because these later steps were moving too slow. If succinyl-CoA levels are building up, doesn't it make sense that step 1 of the citric acid cycle would know that, with "know" in air quotes, so that step 1 could slow down and not contribute to the traffic jam by continuing to pile up alpha-ketoglutarate, isocitrate, and citrate. So citrate synthase, being sensitive to its own product levels, allows the enzyme to slow down if it's going too fast. By being sensitive to succinyl-CoA, citrate synthase can also slow down if the rest of the citric acid cycle is going too slowly. I don't know how many of you are familiar with an old TV show, I Love Lucy. This TV show was popular when my father was a little boy, so I'm not quite that old, but it's still in reruns, and many of us have grown up watching this show even when it was old. There's a famous episode where Lucy and her neighbor Ethel get jobs on a chocolate candy assembly line. And very quickly, too many candies are coming down the line too quickly, and they get backed up. And it's a funny scene where they do everything they possibly can to keep these candies from overflowing. They start shoving them in their mouth, they put them in their pockets, they're pulling them off the line. And you can think of this as citrate synthase. This is what citrate synthase does not want happening to it. It doesn't want to be going too quickly, where it overloads the rest of the system, and it doesn't want to deal with a traffic jam, where the other products from later on in the cycle start building up in front of it. So by remaining sensitive to these two inhibitor levels, there's a lot of information there about how quickly the citric acid cycle is running in general. If succinyl-CoA levels do build up, citrate synthase slows down. That allows the rest of the citric acid cycle to essentially catch up, and then everything can resume at its normal speed. Isocitrate dehydrogenase, the enzyme that's responsible for catalyzing step 3, is activated by ADP and activated by NAD+. Both make sense. High levels of ADP means the cell needs more ATP, and you need the citric acid cycle running. High levels of oxidized NAD+ means you're running low on available electrons, and why not run the citric acid cycle, which can harvest you more. These two conditions mean that the citric acid cycle needs to speed up so that electrons can be harvested and fed into the electron transport chain so that more ATPs can be made. Isocitrate dehydrogenase is an allosteric enzyme, and its positive cooperativity is reduced when bound by these allosteric effectors ADP or NAD+. Each of these two effectors have different binding sites. They're way too different in their size and shape to fit into the same allosteric site. Alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase is inhibited by ATP and by NADH, the opposite logic of what we just said for isocitrate dehydrogenase. If ATP levels are high, you don't need to make more. You shouldn't be running the citric acid cycle. If NADH levels are high, you have plenty of electrons around and you don't need to harvest more. It's also inhibited by succinyl-CoA, with the same logic as citrate synthase, this idea of allowing this enzyme to keep pace or keep tabs on how quickly the rest of the citric acid cycle is going. So if we have a buildup of succinyl-CoA, this enzyme will slow down to allow the later parts of the citric acid cycle to recuperate and to recover. You may remember that in the previous lecture we made a point of mentioning that the PDC and alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase are very similar in their composition, very similar in their kinetics and their enzymatics, and their regulation is no exception to that either. Just as we said for the PDC, alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase is phosphorylated by an onboard kinase, a subunit of this complex, that slows the enzyme down through phosphorylation, and it can be sped up by a dephosphorylation reaction catalyzed by an onboard phosphatase, just as we said for the PDC. Hopefully it's no surprise at this point, but in general, we can sum up the overall regulation of the citric acid cycle by saying that when ATP levels are high, meaning ADP levels are low, that means we have a lot of energy. And or high levels of NADH coupled to, of course, low levels of oxidized NAD+, means that we have plenty of electrons. If either of those are the case, we don't need the citric acid cycle, so shut it down. Conversely, if we have low levels of ATP, which would imply high levels of ADP, we're running low on energy, or low levels of reduced NADH, which would mean high levels of oxidized NAD+, meaning we're running low on harvested electrons, this is where we need the citric acid cycle, so we should speed it up. So these are the general premises we always want to keep in our mind. And again, I hope they're common sense. It just makes sense that the cell would do this. But these general principles will allow the finer points of regulation to sit a bit more comfortably. So to summarize this chunk, when we have a lot of energy measured by high ATP levels, which would also mean that ADP levels are low, the PDC is phosphorylated by a kinase that's part of that complex, and it slows down. No acetyl-CoA means no citric acid cycle. Citric acid cycle is not needed. As we begin to burn through that ATP, so ADP levels climb, the need for the PDC returns, and an onboard phosphatase will dephosphorylate the enzyme, allowing it to speed up again. Acetyl-CoA itself also inhibits the PDC. Its own product turns it down, as well as acetyl-CoA from other sources. If there's plenty of acetyl-CoA around, you don't need to make more. Makes sense. Step 1 of the citric acid cycle, catalyzed by citrate synthase, is inhibited by ATP for energetics, as we just described, NADH for electron availability, as we just described, succinyl-CoA, keeping tabs on how quickly the second half of the citric acid cycle is running, and its own product, citrate, keeping tabs on how quickly the first half of the citric acid cycle is running. The enzyme that catalyzes step 3, isocitrate dehydrogenase, is activated by ADP and NAD+, for reasons that hopefully by now are somewhat obvious. And alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase can be thought of almost essentially as PDC regulation. It's inhibited through a phosphorylation event by an onboard kinase that's responding to high levels of ATP and or NADH, and it is activated by an onboard phosphatase that is responding to high levels of ADP or oxidized NAD+. This complex is also inhibited by succinyl-CoA, its own product, so that the second half of the citric acid cycle bogs down. Alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase does not remain as active. Hopefully this provides you with a good understanding of how the citric acid cycle is regulated, and we get to, in the last chunk, zoom out just a touch and get a better understanding of the role of the citric acid cycle in cellular metabolism overall.